The Spanish Golden Age was a 16th and 17th, lasted from the 16th to the 17th century, and my focus is the Baroque period within that, which is a 17th century phenomenon. Now, before I begin, I actually have a question for all of you. Can anybody name a famous Spanish novel? It begins with a D. Don Quixote. So, well, I guess I'll do it all on my own then. So Don Quixote is an example of a Baroque novel that features a madman. And this was a very common theme in Baroque literature. It was something of a literary craze. So Baroque society was extremely repressive, and you had the Inquisition and you had a bunch of absolute monarchies. So you can kind of understand why madness would then be a theme. But while male madness abounds in Baroque literature, we don't see as many literary mad women. And that is the focus, of course, of my presentation. Now, I think we should situate a little the historical context here. When I use the term madness, I'm not using it in the connotations of madness in the Golden Age were very different from what we have now. So it was before Freud, obviously, and it was not considered a psychological phenomenon as much as it was considered a physical phenomenon and expressed by the theory of the humors. So humoral theory says that bodily fluids, blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm contribute to your personality. So someone who has an excess of black bile, for instance, would be melancholic. They would be gloomy and depressed. The vision that people in this time period had of mental illness was very different from what it is today. You'll also see me switching between madness and folly. There is a distinction here in that madmen were typically seen as more passionate and fools as, sluggish and slow, but they were still grouped together in the same general category, and I discussed both. So before madness really took off in the Baroque, it was a popular topic among 16th century humanist writers, and I look at two humanist texts in my thesis. The first of these is Erasmus of Rotterdam's The Praise of Folly, published in 1511. And in this text, Folly steps up to the pulpit to convince her audience of her importance in the world. Erasmus uses Folly to criticize church authorities. She claims them as her own, so they're all a bunch of fools. But because it's Folly talking, Erasmus is shielded from criticism, because how can you take seriously the words of a fool? Gender matters here. As Patricia Bizel points out, women who took the public sphere in this time period were considered harlots. And Erasmus did not think very highly of women either. If a woman tries to become wise, he said, what else does she do but to play twice the fool? After all, an ape is an ape, though clad in scarlet. So a woman is a woman still, that is to say, foolish. Erasmus was Dutch, and my topic is Spain, but as it turned out, his text was hugely influential. And in 1521, Spanish humanist Hernán López de Yanguas wrote a similar text, The Triumphs of Madness. Now, this text is especially interesting because Yanguas wrote it for his sisters. I should note here that books of conduct were hugely important in this time period, and they denoted the kinds of activities that were proper for a good Christian woman, and also what kind of actions made up the conduct of a bad woman. In Yanguas's text, the speaker, who is interchangeable with Yanguas, is walking through the desert when he meets Madness and her servants, depicted as various vices. Madness, he emphasizes, is only alone with a bunch of women with no men among her. So once again, the harlot theme. So this sort of sexually liberated vision of Madness is very powerful and actually ties him up and forces him to listen to her arguments in favor of her utility. Eventually, Prudence comes along and vanquishes Madness, and Prudence is the model that Yanguas wants his sisters to follow. So in both these texts, Folly and Madness go against the grain for what was expected of women at the time. But in both these texts, the authors really try to put these women back in their place. In the Baroque, however, we find a not quite mad woman who successfully goes against gender norms and creates her own space. This is Erifila, the heroine of Lope de Vega's play, Madness in Valencia. We meet her in the midst of an act of rebellion. She runs away from home with her servant Leonato to escape her father's authority. And she is, she ends up being robbed and raped and left naked in the street. The hospital takes her in and thinking that she is mad because they see the symptoms of madness in her behavior, although she is in fact sane. In spite of this, however, she ends up embracing madness as her own identity and fakes madness in the hospital. She makes the hospital her safe haven from the outside world and from patriarchal authority, and also reminds us of the performativity of gender. By pretending to be a madwoman, she has to reject traditional femininity, which shows us that it is a role as well. We also see Maria de Zayas, who was a writer in this time period, one of the few women who successfully published a book. Zayas very strongly defends female creativity, especially her own. One of the things that she does to defend the act of a woman writing is to create a list of her female predecessors, so the women who came before her who have also done creative works. This list is especially interesting for studiers of Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, the authors of The Madwoman in the Attic, a text from the 70s. Gilbert and Gubar suggest the theory of anxiety of authorship. This is a take on the female version of Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence. So Bloom's theory says that authors are very insecure because they worry that their works are not original. As a result of this, they must kill their literary forefathers symbolically. But Gilbert and Gubar say, wait a minute, this really only applies to men, because female writers don't have those foremothers. So what they face instead is an anxiety of authorship. Can women create? Can women write? So Zayas's list dispels this anxiety and asserts herself as a writer. In her second volume, Disenchantments of Love, Zayas again challenges gender assumptions by featuring a female melancholic in The Ravages of Vice. Melancholy was viewed primarily as a male phenomenon, so one example would be Hamlet in England, or in Shakespeare's writing. And this was because it was seen as a sign of too much intellect. So if someone is melancholic, it's because they're too smart. They think too much. So this was clearly seen as male because women were not capable of such reflection. Lysis, the main character of Disenchantments of Love, gathers her friends together and they tell a story. Thesis tells them this story to express male trickery. So, once upon a time, there were two sisters, Florentina and Magdalena. Florentina fell in love with Magdalena's husband and fell into a melancholic state. So Don Dionys, Magdalena's husband, asks her, "Florentina, what's wrong?" And she confesses her love. They begin a 4-year affair. When Florentina confesses to a priest, he tells her, "You're going to hell." Florentina concocts a plan and tricks Don Dionys into believing that Magdalena has cheated on him. He kills Magdalena, and when he discovers Florentina's trickery, he attacks her for betraying her sister and for killing her sister. Zaius depicts this as an instance of male deception because of Don Dionys' hypocrisy. Although Florentina was also responsible, it is Don Dionys' actions that are to blame. So when women appear as mad in Siglo de Oro literature, Golden Age literature, they, like their male counterparts, depict acts of rebellion. However, because they are women, these acts of rebellion also transgress gender norms.